So joining us now, we have Trevor Aaronson. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So in addition to the podcast, you wrote down a lot of your reporting in a fantastic piece for The Intercept. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. The headline here is "The Snitch in the Silver Hearse. The FBI paid a violent felon to infiltrate Denver's racial justice movement." And this dude, one of his calling cards was he drove this quite notable silver hearse around in Denver and at protests, et cetera. So he became well known quite quickly, kind of out of nowhere within Denver. Before you get into the story, what sort of tipped you off to this dude? What sort of, got your interest as a journalist and led you to follow down this path and pull this thread?
Yeah, so for the last 10, 15 years, I've been reporting on the FBI's counterterrorism program and its use of informants and sting operations to find would-be terrorists, and really kind of highlighting this question of whether the FBI is finding real terrorists or creating them through these sophisticated stings where they provide everything that they need, including the weapons and the money and all of the planning. And so during the summer of 2020, it was a long suspicion of mine that the FBI may use these types of tactics against demonstrators, particularly given the climate that the summer of 2020 was happening in. There were there was a drumbeat for this idea that Antifa and BLM were anti-government extremists or potentially violent. The FBI had previously designated Black political activists as so-called Black identity extremists. And so there seemed to be a predisposition within the FBI to view these demonstrations not as First Amendment protected activity, but potentially as something violent. And the question for me was whether they would use these tactics and powers that had been deployed in the war on terror against these activists. And my suspicion was that they would. And so I'd spent a good amount of time trying to find an example of that and find reporting on that. And, at first wound up empty, and then eventually came across this case through a source that revealed recordings and about 300 pages of internal documents that showed that the FBI did precisely that, using an undercover informant to infiltrate groups in Denver and then try to set them up in violent crimes.
Yeah, I mean, this reads like a straight up entrapment scenario. We're talking about giving out guns, urging activists to become more violent, go on the offensive against the police, all while getting straight up paid by the FBI. Go into some of the details on this story.
Sure. So Mickey Windecker was this guy with a long history of deception and violence. Among his convictions were for sexual assault. He had sex with a 14-year-old when he was 20 and ended up pleading that down to misdemeanor sexual assault. He spent 2 years in prison for stuffing a gun in someone's face and was convicted for felony menacing. While he was in prison in the early 2000s, he was approached for a murder for hire. And instead of doing that, ends up becoming an informant. And as far as we know, that's the beginning of his career as a police cooperator. And then, fast forward 20 years, in the summer of 2020, he goes to local police working with the FBI through the Joint Terrorism Task Force and says, "Hey, I know about these protesters who are saying incendiary things. And do you want to hire me as an informant to look into this?" And I think it's important to keep in mind that what Mickey reported to the FBI was nothing more than First Amendment protected activities. These were things that protesters had said, very incendiary things and certainly questionable, but nonetheless protected by free speech rights. And yet the FBI then opened this investigation using him as a paid informant. And then what he did was kind of insert himself as a leader. And not only did he insert himself as a leader, but he took out tactics from the COINTELPRO playbook of the 1960s. He would accuse the real leaders of the Denver movement of being police cooperators, of being FBI informants, essentially marginalizing them as a result. And in that leadership vacuum kind of rose up in prominence among the activists. And then once he was in a leadership role, he was encouraging violence. He was in apartments filled with guns. His hearse had, guns in the back, and he was encouraging protesters to get more and more violent. And then by the end of August 2020, a number of the protests in Denver had turned extremely violent, with basically full-on assaults against police buildings. Police officers were injured, protesters were injured. Mickey's fingerprints were all over those and encouraging the violence. And so he was doing that more broadly in the Denver activist community, turning these protests that were otherwise peaceful into something much more violent. And at the same time was trying to entrap protesters into plots. The most significant that he tried was to rope 2 protesters into a supposed plot to assassinate Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser. Ultimately was unsuccessful, but tried to get protesters to move more and more toward those kinds of violent plots.
That is so nuts.
Yeah, and when you talk about First Amendment protected speech from these protesters that he was reporting to the FBI, it was things that, we've all probably heard, at least on television, or if you've been to any protest, we're going to burn it down, things of that nature were what they were saying to him. Talk to me, Trevor, about how he sort of picked out the leaders he was going to target, what kind of tactics he used, and what kind of direction he attempted to push them in.
So one of the things that Mickey did that was quite helpful to his ability to infiltrate the Denver activist groups was that, when you look at Mickey, there's this initial feeling that you have, how did this guy infiltrate these groups, right? He dresses like a biker, he's got military style uniform, and he's old, right? He's pushing 50 years old in the group of protesters who are in their teens and 20-somethings. So he was by himself quite suspicious. And what he did that was quite effective was that he allied himself very quickly with activists with the Young Democratic Socialists of America, or YDSA. Very young activists, arguably very naive activists, and those activists became his allies. And so what ended up happening was that the protesters who were rightfully suspicious of this old guy dressed like a biker coming into the protest advocating violence had their suspicions somewhat undermined by the fact that they saw him with these young allies. And there was this feeling that Denver protesters described to me that, okay, this guy seems really suspicious, but he's with the YDSA kids, so he must be okay. And that allowed him to essentially rise up in the movement and become someone that people started to trust. At the same time, what he would do anytime someone became suspicious of him, the most notable example of this is a man named Trey Quinn, who was one of the leaders of the demonstrations in Denver. Trey very quickly suspected that this Mickey guy was an informant. He didn't have proof, and he ended up doing a test where he went to Mickey and he said, speaking wholly in hypotheticals, what if we went and burned down a neighborhood? And Mickey's like, oh yeah, I can get that done. I know a guy, we can do that. And to Trey, that meant this guy was clearly an agent provocateur. And so what Trey then does is back away from him. Mickey at that point realizes that Trey's kind of onto him. And so what Mickey does is then accuse Trey of being an FBI informant himself to all of the other activist community. And that allows Mickey to kind of create a vacuum that he then fills. And once he's in that leadership position, he's pushing more and more people toward violence and getting people to go out and, attack police buildings, getting people out to talk about violent plots. And all of this is then being reported back to the FBI. It's important to understand, too, according to these FBI reports, Mickey wasn't just investigating possible crimes. He was basically collecting intelligence on all of the demonstrators. And so much of the information that's in the FBI files is related to information about activists who are not charged with crimes, activists who are not suspected of crimes, but were simply going out, performing their First Amendment protected activities. And they were then getting FBI files back in the Denver office. Again, this is very reminiscent of what we saw during the COINTELPRO days. This is also directly contrary to what the FBI has stated publicly to Congress. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, has spoken before Congress a number of times and said, we don't investigate ideology, we don't investigate speech. And that's exactly what happened in the Denver case. And I think it's reasonable to assume that it may have happened in other cities as well in the summer of 2020.
Oh, I mean, there's no question about it. So my last question for you is, are there any people who were charged based on this information? And are we going to have a Gretchen Whitmer situation where those people potentially are going to get off? Because clearly, I mean, in a lot of ways, he entrapped many people who were in the commission of some of these crimes.
So the assassination plot that they attempted to construct against Colorado's Attorney General was very similar to the type of tactic you saw in the Gretchen Whitmer case. Ultimately, that was unsuccessful. The 2 people who were part of the supposed plot backed out. But one of those people, one of those activists, a man named Zebediah Hall, did end up purchasing a gun for Mickey and ultimately was charged with purchasing a gun for a felon. The irony being, of course, that Mickey was a felon, but he was also an FBI informant. And so he purchases a gun using FBI money to give the gun to the FBI informant, who then gives it to the FBI, right? Totally victimless crime.
Yeah.
And so Zeb, in the show, in Alphabet Boys, we describe how Zeb, admits what he did, admits that he was wrong. He shouldn't have done it. But the important part to understand is that one of the reasons that Mickey was able to get activists to do things that they might not have otherwise done is that part of his identity was this looming sense of violence. You know, he described how he had fought with the Peshmerga in Iraq, fought against ISIS. He had pictures of his phone of dead ISIS fighters. Some of them, in some of them, he's standing over the dead bodies. And so there was always this sense that the activists had that Mickey was dangerous and that he could physically harm them. And so a number of activists, including Zeb, described that once they got close to Mickey, they felt they couldn't back away from him for fear that he would physically harm them. And they felt, compelled to do the things that he had asked them to do, which, again, I think is part of the more insidious tactic that the FBI used in this regard, that they inserted Mickey knowing that he was a person who would be quite intimidating. And then once people got close to him, they felt they couldn't back away. And that's how he was able to entice people into further and further crimes.
It is insane. I mean, there would have been no crime of purchasing gun for a felon if you didn't have the FBI encouraging, setting up, paying for, and intimidating this person ultimately into committing this crime. So far from disrupting crime, they're actually creating and encouraging it. Not to mention, that with Mickey's encouragement, the Denver protests turn far more violent. My last question for you, Trevor, is, what was the fallout in the activist community? Because obviously part of the goal of COINTELPRO was to disrupt these groups and pit them against each other. Were they successful ultimately in doing that in Denver?
Yeah, so if one of the FBI's goals was to undermine the movement and undermine these groups, they were successful. Starting in late September, there was an abrupt stop to these demonstrations in Denver. A lot of these groups splintered. A number of groups that were allied together ended up splitting apart. And a lot of that was due to the confusion and distrust that was sown as a result of Mickey's activity. Many people in Denver suspected that there were FBI infiltrators in their groups. They started to trust each other less, and as a result started to organize with each other less. And ultimately that undermined the movement. That's exactly what the Church Committee found in 1975, that in COINTELPRO, the FBI deployed this tactic to devastating effect in order to undermine Black political movements throughout the country. And we saw that happen exactly in Denver, that because of Mickey's infiltration, not only did these protests turn violent, not only were people attempted to be set up in crimes, but the overall movement ended up being harmed as a result of the distrust that was engendered due to his activities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unbelievable. Great work tracking all of this down. I know you spent, I can't even imagine how many hours you spent digging into this. I've listened to the first episodes of the podcast that are out. They're both fantastic. Guys, check it out. It's called Alphabet Boys. And Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. We're super grateful.
That's right. We're going to have a link to that podcast right in the description. So go ahead and subscribe.
Sure.
Thanks, Trevor.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.